Both sides.
Everybody rise, please. Please be seated. Court will come to order.
Bring a jury on in, Mr. Watson. Under the prior stipulation, polling is waived and presence is noted. Ms. Lasko back, you ready for cross? Mr. Haggard, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Lasko, you made reference this morning earlier to a textbook in the field, Microscopy of Hair by Mr. Hicks, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Is this the leading textbook in the field?
Well, as far as strictly microscopy and comparison of hairs, that is probably about the only book I know dealing with the forensic aspect of hair comparison.
Okay. Is this an exhaustive treatise in the field?
Well, I don't really know what you mean by an exhaustive treatise.
Does it exhaust the field of hair comparison?
Objection, Your Honor.
If she may ask, can't answer it, she may answer.
It takes some of the commonest forms of hair that a forensic examiner would be involved in analyzing, from animal hairs on through human hairs, and then the different races of human hair, and it explains the basic characteristics that can be used for the examination and comparison of the hairs.
Well, my question is, does it exhaust the discipline in the field? Is it a comprehensive study in the field?
It's difficult to answer that yes or no as to whether it's comprehensive or not, because most of the ability to examine and compare hairs to state a conclusion is knowing how to perform the examination, then getting the experience through performing this examination to be able to state a conclusion. So this text tells you what traits and characteristics to use for examining hairs and what conclusions you reach. You need to build up the experience on your own.
Well, does it tell the microscopist, yourself as an example, everything to do in the field?
Well, I'm going to object what the book tells anybody.
I think the question of that, I would sustain that objection.
My question, I'd like a response to, is it comprehensive and exhaustive?
Objection, she's already answered the question.
I'll let her answer that.
At this point in time, with what can be done with hair examination and comparison, yes.
Is this the book?
Yes, sir.
How many pages in this book, this textbook, are on human hair?
Oh, I believe they're probably about 5 or so.
Well, giving you the deference, there are 27 pages
Objection to
on human hair.
Don't testify now, Mr. Haggard. You know better than that.
And is this the exhaustive treatise, the only treatise on human hair comparison?
Sustain.
Objection.
Is this the book upon which you rely as the basis for your work?
Objection.
I'll let her
She
answer.
testified to. She said it was her training and experience.
Well, she's already testified to that. There's a text she uses. I'll let her testify to it.
The question, please, one more time, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Is this the book which you rely upon as the authority in the field?
That is a reference source that we use that applies directly to the forensic examination of hair, yes.
I'm talking about the book.
You're arguing with her now. Sustain the objection.
Is there any other, quote, textbook or leading treatise in the field other than this pamphlet?
As far as forensic examination and comparison, I am not aware of any published, thick, multiple-aged textbook.
Are you familiar with Gradwell's Legal Medicine? Have you read that?
I have not read it, but we do have it in the laboratory.
And is that a recognized authority in the field?
In various sections in the laboratory, it is, yes.
Are you familiar with Mr. Gaudet and his articles? And is he a recognized authority in the field of hair microscopy?
Yes, sir.
Let's talk about the limits of the science of hair comparison.
Let's don't talk about anything, Your Honor.
Mr. Haggard, we ain't gonna do no talking. You ask and she'll talk.
In terms of the limits of the science of hair comparison, you cannot make an identification, can you?
Objection. Form of the question.
Sustain.
Can you make an identification between two hairs, an unknown and a known hair?
Objection to the form of the question.
I'll let her answer that.
As I said earlier, a hair comparison is not an absolute identification.
Best you can say is could have come or could not have come, or there are similarities and dissimilarities which you can't distinguish between.
Those are the 3 different kinds of conclusions that I could reach, yes.
And the reason for this is because the basic substructures of the hair are common to all hairs, are they not?
Come sidebar, gentlemen. Come up, Madam Reporter. Haggard, if you keep testifying, my friends, I'm gonna get you. That's all I'm gonna say to you. So the record is clear. You're not gonna testify, you understand? I may ask this lady a question, but you're not gonna testify. And the next time, it's gonna be on me. All right?
Is not the reason that you are limited to...
What is the reason you're limited, Mr. Haggard? That's the question.
Your Honor, may I be entitled to lead on cross-examination?
You can, you sure can.
Yeah. All right.
Let's try to find out the reason before you get into it.
Well, I know the reason, Your Honor, and
Well, I know that.
in a leading way, I think it would facilitate cross-examination.
Ask the question.
All right. Is it not, in fact, the reason that the science of hair comparison is limited to those three conclusions? That the basic substructures of all hairs are common to all hair.
Well, that's what gives you the ability to compare, is the fact that these characteristics are present in all hairs, and that they do have different variations of their presence, so they are comparable.
And that is also what limits your conclusions, is it not?
Objection to an arguing with a witness.
I'll let him answer.
The limit to the conclusion is on the basis that not all hair has been examined that belongs to everyone in the whole world. People's hair changes with time. Nothing would be constant. It is not an identification.
Not talking about numerical probability now. I'm talking about the basic common substructures. Is it not a fact that all the substructures of a hair are common to all human hairs?
And as I said earlier,
Yes or no?
that is why
She may
you can
explain her
compare.
answer.
First, may I have a yes or no, Your Honor?
Yes, you may answer him yes and no, and then you may explain your answer, young lady.
Would you please answer the question?
Is it not a scientific fact that all the basic substructures of a human hair, some of which you have depicted here on this diagram, are common to all hair?
Yes.
Thank you. Is it not also a scientific fact that all the basic subcharacteristics can be different in different hairs?
That is what gives validity to the comparison of hairs, yes.
Is it not also what limits your ability to draw a conclusion?
As I said, it is not an identification, so it does not limit my ability to draw a conclusion. Based on my experience and my training, I am able to form a conclusion, and it is not an identification.
Would you please answer the question, yes or no? Is that not also what limits your ability to draw a conclusion?
Not entirely.
Is it not also a scientific fact that you cannot identify a human hair point for point?
That is correct.
And is that not the rational basis, the reason behind the fact that you cannot make an identification?
Objection.
Ms. Taggart, I think she's testified 3 times that there is no identification.
I'm
State
just-
the objection.
I'm just connecting it, Your Honor,
Well,
to the reason she cannot make an identification.
sustain the objection.
There is no objective scale of similarity in the science of hair comparison, is there?
Yes, there is.
An objective scale?
Yes.
And what is this objective scale?
You said objective.
I said objective.
That's correct.
Who has designed the objective scale?
The characteristics that I described to you that I examine microscopically, I can qualitate because I can describe to you what is the cuticle, what is the pigment, what is the medulla. I can also quantitate it, as I described to you earlier, in that a cuticle is thick, thin, it is average. A medulla is present or absent. Now, I can ascribe numbers to these and therefore fit your precise objective definition of scientific.
Who is the author of this objective scale?
It is based on the training that I have received. So it is no set scale that everyone who does hair comparisons will designate everything, the characteristics that they observe as being the same. As long as I am consistent with the way I describe the characteristics that I examine microscopically and compare, that is what I'm concerned with.
Do you understand what I mean by objective?
Yes, sir, I do.
Do you understand by objective that I mean a scale which all hair microscopists would follow, that would be the same for all?
I object.
I'll let her answer that question.
It's my opinion that as far as I'm concerned, the examination that I performed is objective.
Your scale, is that what you're talking about?
Objection.
Overruled.
You're talking about your personal scale, are you not?
Based on the training that I have received from other analysts who were trained in the same manner.
And that scale is subjective to you solely, is it not?
Not really, because in the beginning of being trained in examining hairs and in discussing it with the person who was training me, we would discuss what is thick, what is thin, what is dense, what is not dense, what is present, what is absent. So the ascription of a quality or quantity pretty much is consistent.
Where do you compare your subjective opinion to an objective scale?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'll let her answer that.
I have the scale that you use, that you are discussing, is one that is utilized by me because of my training.
It's solely your scale,
Objection.
correct?
Overruled.
Based on the training that I have received from the experienced analysts who have trained me.
Now, who in the field, if you know, has ever created an objective scale?
Well, Gaudet has, who you have mentioned.
Do you consider Mr. Gaudet's 22 morphological characteristics as an objective scale?
If you look further under the 22, you find that he has delineated those characteristics into a more definitive description.
Even the subcategories under the 22 groups, they are not an objective scale, are they?
They are not a numerical objective scale, but they are further delineated so that if you want to apply a number to it, you can.
Does not Mr. Gaudet say that even the individual examiner's comparisons vary from day to day?
Objection, Your Honor. Got to lay a predicate for that.
I'll let her answer that.
Yes, they could.
So even your subjective scale will vary from day to day as you look at a hair, will it not?
It can, but I have found that in going back to past reports when I've gone to testify, that the descriptions that I have attributed to standards and to unknowns that I have examined, there has been no obvious great discrepancy that could change any of the results of the examination.
Well, the fact itself that you have found no discrepancy, in your words, no objective discrepancy, is a subjective judgment, is it not?
I'm not really sure what you're trying to say.
In other words, your own review of your own work for its, quote, objectivity is a subjective review.
Your Honor, what possible relevance?
I will sustain an objection to that.
Is there an objective test for distinguishing dissimilarity from variation?
An actual objective test, I don't believe so, no.
So what is the difference then between dissimilarity and variation?
That would depend on what the characteristic looks like. It would depend on the exhibit, I think.
Would it not depend on the examiner?
I'm sure it could also depend on the examiner,
It would depend on the experience of the examiner, wouldn't it?
partially.
So as a matter of, in terms of the science of hair microscopy, there's no way to say what the difference is between dissimilarity and variation, is there?
Objection.
I'll let her answer that.
If I could know what specifically you are speaking about, that I could tell you what would be considered dissimilar as opposed to variation.
I'm talking specifically about the principles themselves in hair microscopy of dissimilarity as opposed to the principle of variation in hair microscopy.
Now, variation to me is a characteristic, dissimilarity is a trait.
To you.
Correct.
Has there ever been created a formula where subjective or personal determinations of the examiner can be standardized?
To my knowledge, no.
Now, there is no database for any statistical incidence of the occurrence of the subcharacteristics of the hair in the general population, is there?
I personally do not have one, no.
And are you familiar with the work in the field that says that the subcharacteristics insofar as specificity for comparison are no better than the general ABO blood type group system?
Objection, Your Honor. He's going to testify.
If that's in the form of a question, I'll let him ask the question.
Are you familiar with that?
No, sir.
All right, you previously said that you recognize Gradwell's legal medicine in the field. Let me read you this quote and ask you if you agree or disagree with it. As a medium for positive personal identification, hair is disappointing as yet, for it has no morphological or physical features as exclusive to an individual. There is nothing about hair comparable to the specificity of fingerprints, and at the best, the probability of establishing identity from hair is perhaps no greater than the probability of determining identification using only the ABO blood group system on blood smears. Martin, 1957.
Objection, move to strike.
Are you,
I'll let her answer the question.
are you familiar with that? And do you agree or disagree with that?
Well, you're speaking again of identification, and as I've said earlier, I have not performed an identification, I performed a comparison.
I'm speaking.
And because that was written in 57, hair comparisons and examinations have become more describable, essentially, in that the examiner just doesn't sit down, put a standard under one side of the microscope, put an unknown under the other, and look at it and go, oh, it looks about the same, and makes a decision. We base the decision on the microscopic characteristics that are present. Now, as far as it's being as significant as the ABO blood grouping?
No, ma'am. Probable. Probable. It's no more probable than the ABO blood grouping system.
I have no statistical backup to be able to comment on that.
In making a conclusion of similarity or dissimilarity, do you require all the characteristics, all the morphological characteristics and subcharacteristics to be indistinguishable microscopically?
To be able to make what kind of conclusion, sir?
Similarity or dissimilarity? 1 and 2 of your 3 possible conclusions.
The microscopic characteristics should be microscopically the same for them to be similar, and significant differences should appear in order to say that they are different.
Try to answer my question, though, ma'am. Listen to the question.
Wait a minute, Your Honor.
Yeah, the answer does not go with the question.
Well, then move
That
to
was her
strike.
answer.
Right.
It might not have been the one you were looking for, but that was her answer. Now restate another question.
Do you require all the subcharacteristics to be microscopically indistinguishable in order to reach a conclusion of similarity or dissimilarity?
That would depend a lot on the microscopic characteristics that are present. In most instances, the ones that would be present should be microscopically similar to be able to state that they are similar.
Mrs. Lasko, what I'm asking you as a principle of hair microscopy, independent of any particular examination that you want to make special reference to? As a principle of hair microscopy, do you require all the sub-characteristics to be indistinguishable in order to reach a conclusion of similarity?
Indistinguishable in the sense of being microscopically the same, yes.
All right. And all these microscopic characteristics must be the same, correct?
Microscopically the same, yes.
It's not sufficient to rely upon a range of similarity, is it?
Objection.
My letter ends.
The range of similarity is present in the hair standard that you have for comparison that allows you to set up the boundaries within which you are working in order to compare the unknown to see if it fits in.
Let me ask you this. If there's one distinguishable sub-characteristic, then the hair is distinguishable, is it not?
I don't know. I wouldn't rely on one distinguishable characteristic, depending on what that characteristic is. It depends a lot on what you have microscopically in front of you as to what your conclusion is going to be.
I'm sure you will admit this article, Don't Miss a Hair, published by the FBI, as an authority in the field, correct?
I've read the article.
Let me ask you if you agree or disagree with this statement from the article. It can be determined, however, that the hair of an unknown source matches a known hair sample from a certain individual in all microscopic characteristics, and accordingly could have originated from the same source, or that it is sufficiently dissimilar to the known hair sample and therefore is not from the same person. All microscopic characteristics
Yes, sir.
have to be the same.
Microscopically the same, yes.
Thank you. Hair is a pretty durable substance, is it not?
Yes, sir.
And it can last for years, particularly in a protected environment.
It can.
And in fact, hairs from mummies have been recovered after centuries, have they not?
Yes, sir.
Would you also give us an approximation of how many human hairs, head hairs, we lose a day?
The information varies with that. I've read as much as 100 hairs a day can be lost from the entire body to as little as 50 hairs a day.
All right, at 100 hairs a day, that would be 36,000 hairs a year, right?
From the entire
Objection.
body.
Roughly.
Objection.
What happened to the other 5 days?
36,500.
But
Close enough for government work. 36,000 a year. And these hairs can come to rest in many places, can they not?
Yes, sir.
And these hairs can be transferred by clothing or otherwise right here from Miami to New York, can they not?
Yes, they can.
Did you have occasion to examine what I believe is file number 70 in the Florida Department of Law Enforcement enumeration? Do you have that?
Yes, sir.
Did you have occasion to examine some known and unknown submissions in that case?
Yes, sir.
Okay. With reference to sub-exhibit 9, tell me what you did.
This was case number 70.
Yes. Lisa Levy?
Exhibit number 9
Yes.
was described as being sample of hair from right shoulder of victim.
All right. And what did you do, on what date did you receive that, first of all?
I believe that I received that from Richard Stevens on January the 18th, 1978.
Okay, on what date did you make an examination?
I object to the questions beyond the scope. Overruled.
What date did you make an examination?
I don't recall exactly.
Do you have a note there in your file?
I believe it was on August the 2nd, 1978.
And on August the 2nd, 1978, what did you do in preparing Exhibit 9 for comparison to the submitted standards?
I mounted the hairs that were contained in the exhibit on a microscope slide.
And how did you mount them?
I mounted them in permount, which is a fluid that hardens. You put it on the microscope slide, place the hair in the permount, and put a glass cover slip on top of it. It's a permanent mount.
All right, do you always use permount?
Yes, sir.
And did you use it in all your examinations?
Yes, sir.
Do you know how this alters the refractive index of the slide?
I think there might be a bit of a change.
How much?
I don't know.
What's the refractive index of hair?
The refractive index of hair will vary from individual to individual and within an individual.
What's the accepted mean value?
I don't know.
So you do not know how much permount alters the refractive index of the hair, correct?
It doesn't matter. The refractive index is not an examination that I perform on the hair.
Refractive index is an additional examination, is it not, used by some hair examiners?
I don't know of any hair examiners who use refractive index routinely.
Has been used by Paul Kirk in the field, has it not?
Objection.
She knows she will.
Is Paul Kirk a recognized authority in the field of hair comparison?
Paul Kirk has written several forensic textbooks, and by some people he is recognized as an authority, yes.
Thank you. All right, after you mounted it in permount, then what did you do?
I examined it microscopically,
How microscopically?
under the microscope.
Stereoscopically or comparison microscope?
It would have been under the higher power comparison microscope,
Okay, how many magnification?
from approximately 125 magnification on up through 400.
How did you mount Exhibit 9 together or separately?
Okay, exhibit number 9, you're speaking of a sample of hair from the right shoulder of victim, is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Case number 70, sub-exhibit 9.
It was mounted together.
When you looked at sub-exhibit 9, what were the morphological characteristics that you noted?
The characteristics that I noted were that they were different from any of the standards that I had present and were dissimilar to them.
Well, specifically, what characteristics?
I don't have the specific characteristics written down.
Do you have any notes at all as to that comparison?
I have the notes in the file itself, but none that would microscopically describe those hairs.
You don't have any notation as to the individual morphological characteristics of Sub-Exhibit 9?
No, the purpose of my examination is to look for and compare unknown hairs with the standards, to either find an unknown hair that is similar to any of the standards or to eliminate the hairs. It is not to sit down and categorize and classify every hair in each exhibit for the entire case.
You did reach a conclusion that Exhibit number 9 was not similar to Mr. Bundy's hair, did you not?
That's correct.
Do you have the morphological characteristics of Mr. Bundy?
Yes, sir.
What are those?
Which ones particularly?
All of them.
I found that the scale on the hair was quite obvious in both of the, in the standard, that the cuticle had a yellowish cast to it, that the medulla was generally continuous. It went down the entire shaft, and that there was, excuse me, some opacity to it, and that it was average to large in the amount of area that it occupied within the cortex, that the pigmentation had generally large to medium-sized granules, and that the pigmentation was clumped along the periphery of the cortex, meaning near the cuticle, and that in some other hairs that were darker in color, the pigment distribution was more general, in that it was pretty consistent throughout the interior of the hair. There were some large, what appeared to be ovoid bodies in some of the darker hairs. The tips appeared to have been cut. Excuse me. Those are the most significant ones I can think of just offhand.
How about transverse section?
I didn't perform a cross-section.
Do you have any notes as to the morphological characteristics of Mr. Bundy's hair?
Yes, sir.
All right, would you give me the benefit of those notes?
What, would you like the notes themselves?
Yes.
I object, John, unless the witness is testifying from it. Don't give any notes.
She just testified from Mr. Haggard to answer your question.
May I examine the notes, Your Honor?
You
Further
want to
cross?
examine the notes?
Please.
Your Honor, the notes are my own personal.
I understand that they're also the subject matter of this litigation. You may examine both, and I don't give him anything except those.
I don't know if I can.
Proceed along, Mr. Haggard.
Okay, I have just two more if I could finish writing them.
Don't you have a report with those in it?
No, Your Honor. It's the first time we've ever had these.
Did you ask for a lab report?
Your Honor, when the deposition was taken, they were not asked for apparently,
All
or
right.
they were not moved for. In
All
any
right.
event, we've not had them before.
All right.
See this?
Okay, Ms. Lasko, if you would help me with a few of your abbreviations there, I think I'll have it straightened out. All right. You wrote, look like tello roots. What did you write? Or did you mean yellow roots?
Telogen roots.
Cut tips approximately 3-inch long, medium brown color. Cut thick, scales, and then you have apparently times obvious. What did you mean by the X, times or what?
Very obvious.
Pardon?
Very obvious.
All right.
Your Honor, are we gonna try this lawsuit on some piece of paper that she has?
If it's probative to the issue, Mr. Simpson, we sure will.
The objection that I have is if he wants to use it for impeachment
So
purposes,
you may, you're gonna have a crack back. If you wanna offer it, you may do so.
Pigmentation, general to peripheral streak clumps. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Granules, large to medium, and then I could not read the next comment out to the right.
Gapping slight to medium.
Slight to medium,
Yes, sir.
okay. Small symmetrical speckles,
Yes, sir.
referring to the granules,
Referring to the clumps of granules.
referring to the clumps of granules.
Yes, sir.
Medulla, absent to continuous, and then there was a word that was difficult to read.
Translucent.
All right. Thin to average.
Yes, sir.
And then it looked like you had a CF there for cortical fusi.
Yes, sir.
All right. None at root.
Numerous at root.
Numerous at root.
Yes, sir.
Some ovoids streaked.
Yes, sir.
Where were the ovoids?
Within the cortex of the hair.
Cortex variable to what?
Variable definition.
Variable definition. Diameter irregular.
Yes, sir.
In what way irregular?
There was some variation in the diameter along the shaft. The hair was not perfectly cylindrical.
Returning to Exhibit 70, I believe you indicated that you found 10 or more hairs that were dissimilar to the standards.
Which exhibit again, please, sir?
70, Lisa Levy's room.
Oh, wait a minute, Exhibit 70 is in evidence.
Exhibit 70 under FDLE number. Your number.
The FDLE number is 70. What exhibit in case 70?
Well, you indicated in your deposition that you found 10 or more hairs that were dissimilar without reference to which exhibits. Do you know where the 10 or more hairs came from?
I don't know what you're speaking of.
Referring you to deposition taken of yourself on October 25th, 1978 in Tallahassee, and the court reporter, Ms. Frances Thigpen, was present reporting the proceedings, wherein you were asked on page 68, question, do you know how many, referring to case number 70 above, said not a great number, maybe around, of the hairs that I examined. Where I went as far as comparison, they decided that they were dissimilar to all the hairs present. I'd say there were probably about 10 or so. I'm not really sure exactly. Now, do you remember that, first of all?
Vaguely.
All right. Do you know what 10 or more dissimilar hairs you were referring to from the sweepings of Lisa Levy?
I think it was referring to, of the exhibits that I had examined, how many hairs did I find that were dissimilar to any of the standards submitted?
The exhibits under case number 70.
Correct.
Right. There are 10 or more dissimilar hairs.
Yes, sir.
Objection to the repetition, right?
Yes.
Now, where did these hairs that are dissimilar to Mr. Bundy come from?
I have no idea where they came from.
Do you have any notes as to their morphological characteristics?
As I said earlier, I did not categorize and classify all the hairs that I examined. I just compared them and eliminated them, or compared them and stated a similarity.
You have no notes that we may examine here today then to test their similarity or dissimilarity in terms of their morphological characteristics?
Objection, she's already testified that.
Did you examine some sweepings in reference to case number 70, your case number, from a Clairol bottle, or that were taken from the vicinity of the Clairol bottle, from the floor?
Now, those were two separate exhibits. Which one are you speaking of?
Well, first of all, did you sweep or collect any hairs from the bottle itself?
There were no hairs on the bottle to my knowledge.
Did any police officers submit to you any hairs that were taken from the floor vicinity of where the bottle was found?
As far as specifically from the area where the bottle was found, I don't know. There were vacuum sweepings submitted to us from general areas in the rooms of the different victims.
So you do not know about any hairs that may have come off the bottle?
No, sir.
Objection, she's already
She's
testified.
sustained. She's answered.
Looking at case number 71, Cheryl Thomas, where you submitted some hairs from a stick recovered at the Dunwoody scene.
Would you have an exhibit number on that, please, sir?
$15.
From exhibit number 15? Yes, sir, I believe there was one hair.
And what were the morphological characteristics of this hair?
I don't know, sir.
Do you have any notes to that?
I don't believe so, none other than the hair was not suitable for comparison.
If it were not suitable, in what way was it not suitable?
Either that the hair was too short and there wasn't enough microscopic characteristic present to be examined and compared, or that the hair had been either chemically bleached or in some other way was not suitable for comparison.
Did you state that in your report?
No, sir, I don't believe so.
Well, why do you think that's the case now then?
Objection.
Sustained.
Do you have any notes that says it was too short or that it was bleached?
Let me look and see. This is from case number 71, correct?
71, sub-exhibit 15.
The fragment was less than 1/4 of an inch long.
Which fragment?
The one hair from that exhibit?
Did you do a transverse section on it?
No, sir.
Do you have any notes on hair collected from the point of entry or the suspected point of entry, sub-exhibit 27
Of 71?
of 71, Your Honor? Before you go on to that, if I could just ask you, how much hair does it take to do a cross-section?
I object, she didn't say she did a cross-section.
And cross-section would be how many millimicrons?
I don't know offhand.
Certainly a lot less than 1/4 of an inch. wouldn't it?
Objection. Sustained.
Okay, returning to the question. You have exhibit, sub-exhibit 27 in case number 71.
Yes, sir.
What were the morphological characteristics of that hair?
That hair was similar in its microscopic characteristics to the head hair standard of the victim, Thomas, who lived there.
Did you make any notes as to the characteristics? Not your conclusion.
The actual characteristics?
Yes, ma'am.
No, except that it was similar to.
I understand. I move to strike the answer as non-responsive.
Rules, she says.
Not asking for your conclusion, ma'am. I'm asking what were the morphological characteristics of the hair taken from the point of entry?
They were the same as the microscopic characteristics that were present in the head hair standard.
Specifically, what were they?
I don't know what they were specifically.
Do you have any notes as to what they were specifically?
Not to their specific characteristics, no.
Directing your attention to to the sweepings from the floor of the bedroom, I believe is Exhibit 22.
In the same case?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
How many hairs were in Exhibit 22?
I didn't examine Exhibit 22.
You did not examine it at all?
No, sir.
Were there not hundreds of hairs from Exhibit 22?
I don't know.
Do you have that packet?
Not with me, no, sir.
Was there not a whole bag of hair taken from the floor of the bedroom?
Objection. Already answered.
Sustained.
Do you have any independent recollection here today whether there was a whole bag of hair taken from the floor of Cheryl Thomas's bedroom?
Objection.
I let her answer if she's got any recollection.
From my notes, I had that Exhibit 22 was the vacuum sweepings from the bedroom area, and that the hairs were separated into groups, and that's as far as the examination went.
How many hundreds of hairs did you separate into groups?
I have no idea.
Were there also sweepings from the bedding of Cheryl Thomas?
I assisted Dick Stevens in sweeping some of the bed clothing from Cheryl Thomas, yes.
All right. How many hairs were in the bedding
Which particular exhibit, please?
of Cheryl Thomas? I believe that was also submitted as Exhibit 22.
As Exhibit 22?
Sub-Exhibit 22, same case number.
As being the sweepings from her bed clothing?
From the bedding, according to my notes. You may have different notes.
I have separate exhibits as being the pillow and pillowcase, another pillow and pillowcase, some sheets, bedspread.
Would you give us the numbers
quilt.
so we can have comparable notes? On
Which?
the bedding, yes ma'am.
Which?
On the bedding,
From 71 Thomas.
right.
Exhibit 1 was sweepings from the pillow and pillowcase.
All right,
Exhibit 3 was sweepings from a blue sheet.
all right.
Exhibit 6 were sweepings from a pillow and a pillowcase.
7 was hospital sheet.
Correct.
Any others? 10 was another hospital sheet.
Correct.
12 was a bedspread.
Yes.
Okay. 16 was a patchwork quilt.
Yes.
All right. And 18 was the bed quilt.
Correct.
Any others? Those constitute a comprehensive list of bedding.
That I examined, yes.
All right. Now, how many hairs did you elicit from there?
From which?
From the bedding. All those as a composite exhibit. 1, 3, 6, 7, 10, 12, 16, and 18.
Approximately 150 hairs total.
Okay. What did you do with those 150 hairs?
I examined and compared them with each of the standards that was submitted.
All right. How did you initially separate them?
After each of the items was swept separately, as I described earlier, I removed the hairs from the remaining trace debris that was left in the original fold, and I put these hairs into a separate fold.
How many groups did you put them into?
I don't recall. I believe that I probably examined it for the hairs that would be suitable for comparison, since the real tiny fragments or the hairs that were broken or twisted that would not have been suitable for comparison.
All right, from your notes then, how many hairs were unsuitable for comparison from the bedding?
It looks like approximately 15. I'm not exactly sure.
What did you do with the other 135?
Compared those with the standards.
Did you mount them?
No, sir.
How many of the 135 did you mount for microscopic comparison?
I don't recall offhand.
Do you have any notes?
She's gonna change papers around.
I believe approximately 15 to 20 were mounted, if my mental addition is correct.
All right, what did you do with the other 120?
The remaining hairs were similar to Thomas, probably.
Probably. What does that mean?
I macroscopically examined the hairs, and Cheryl Thomas' hair was from 5 to 15 inches long and was red-brown in color and was quite thick and generally pretty straight. Most of the hairs I was able to examine macroscopically that were similar to hers, I was able to eliminate, and that constituted most of the volume of hairs that you speak of from the bed clothing.
Well, do you have any notes on
To what sense?
that? What you did with the other 120 hairs, probably.
Objection to the
Just nine.
Before we go farther, could we return a moment to Exhibit 27? That was the point of entry hair in the same case number. And I believe you testified a few moments ago that that hair was similar to Cheryl Thomas's hair, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had a standard from Cheryl Thomas, I believe that was 71-78, head hair standard label from Thomas, correct?
Yes, sir.
If you recall in your deposition on October 25th, 1978, where you were asked the following question, in exhibit number 27, was the hair from the point of entry? Answer, yes.
What page?
73. Question, and it was not microscopically similar to the standards? Answer, as listed, no. Recall those questions and answers?
Yes, sir. If I might explain that. When Mr. Bundy was deposing me on that particular deposition, the standards that he was speaking of with reference to that was that which was listed immediately above, and that does not include Cheryl Thomas's standard.
You have here on your report captioned standards, and then you have under that 71-77 pubic hair standard labeled from Thomas, 71-78 head hair standard labeled from Thomas.
That's correct.
Now those are standards, aren't they?
Yes, sir. If you'll go to the next paragraph, I proceed to discuss the standards.
As to another exhibit, exhibit 17.
No, sir.
correct?
No, sir. Under the results, you go down to the third paragraph. The statement, there are no hairs present in any of the above listed exhibits 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 27, which are similar to, and then there's a listing of standards. All of those standards listed are all of the standards that I compared with those exhibits, except Cheryl Thomas, because it is not really significant to find an individual's own head or pubic hair in their own apartment.
Is there anywhere in that paragraph where you mentioned exhibit number 27?
Yes, sir.
I only see exhibit 17, Ms. Lasko.
It's in the third paragraph.
Looking at sub-exhibit 23, how many hairs did you elicit from the kitchen floor?
I didn't examine that exhibit.
Do you know how many hairs were in that exhibit?
Objection, that you didn't examine.
You just calling for the number in the exhibit? Don't
Yes,
you
Your
have
Honor.
it in your report?
No, Your Honor.
You have a report that indicated, and you tell it.
Go ahead, how many?
I'm sorry, what was the
How
question?
many hairs in sub-exhibit 23 taken from the kitchen floor of Ms. Thomas's
I
apartment?
didn't examine that exhibit. I don't know how many hairs were present.
Now, do you know where the bag of hair in exhibit 22 is today? Is that in Miami?
No, sir.
Do you know where it is?
It is with the remaining trace sweepings from this case in Tallahassee.
Do you know where the other 122 hairs taken from the composite exhibits of the bedding are today?
Most of them are also in Tallahassee with the trace evidence from this case.
Do you know where all the sweepings are from the kitchen floor in Ms. Thomas's apartment, number 23?
That should also be in Tallahassee.
When an exhibit that you are sweeping comes into contact with other areas, can you justifiably separate that in terms of your sweepings?
Objection.
I'd sustain that. I don't think that's quite clear.
Assuming hypothetically, if you have two garments that are together,
Objection.
Go ahead.
is there not sufficient hair transference and sufficient probability of hair transference between the two garments that they must be treated as one exhibit in terms of sweeping?
Routinely in the laboratory, if we do receive two garments that are packaged together or have been wrapped together, we treat them as one exhibit, because I couldn't tell you from which exhibit any of the trace evidence came from. It comes in as a composite.
Did you realize that this piece of pantyhose in Exhibit 17 was first found intertwined in the bedding?
Objection.
Does she realize that?
Yes.
I'll let her answer.
No, I do not.
So you don't know what reference these other 120 hairs taken from the bedding have to the pantyhose, do you?
Objection.
Sustain.
Did you realize that Exhibit 17, the pantyhose was placed on the floor for photography? The
Check.
bedroom floor?
Objection.
I'll let her answer.
I do not know.
And you don't know what connection these other 150 hairs from Exhibit 22 had to the pantyhose after it was placed on the floor, do you?
No, sir, I do not.
And you don't know whether these three hairs that you examined in Exhibit 17 came from the bedding or the floor, the bedroom floor, do you?
I removed the hairs from the pantyhose. That's all I can say.
And you don't know how they got there, correct?
No, sir, I do not.
Would you step to the board for a moment? If we could turn over this drawing and should I tear this off, Your Honor, or turn it over?
Oh, we put it into evidence. We wanted it into evidence.
Well, maybe we can do it better, Mr. Simpson. You know that?
We'll offer that into evidence, Your Honor.
Court will receive it out of order. Mark it as an exhibit.
Exhibit 3, 25, exhibit number 71.
Would you step to the board, Mrs. Lasko, and give us the basic outline again of the hair, and then we'll work from there.
What's wrong with the old diagram, Your Honor? What?
I didn't want to mess up your diagram.
Now, he's going to get some further testimony on it, I see.
Which would you like?
Just start with basic cuticle, cortex, and medulla. All right. Now, what are the variations in color, speaking of these characteristics on a hair?
Move it out a little bit, young lady, so they can see that you're thinking. Just,
What are the
can all of you
variations?
see it now?
What are the variations in color?
Variations in color would be due to the presence of the pigment and the concentration of the pigment.
And what is the scale? Can you give me a scale, say going from black to white?
For what?
For the hair, color variation.
For whose?
Any hair.
Hair color variation can range from colorless to light blonde, dark blonde, light brown, medium brown, dark brown, and very dark brown to black.
And where would you put red?
And red also, yes. I'm sorry.
Okay. Can you give me a scale on pigment density? First of all, explain what pigment density is.
The density of the pigment refers to how concentrated the pigment is in the cortex of the hair. In the Negroid race, the pigment has a tendency to be very dense, almost to the point of being opaque, so that sometimes it is not possible to see microscopic detail because of the density of the pigment.
All right. You give us some representations on pigment density on your chart there.
I'm not very good at drawing this kind of thing, and I don't believe I could justifiably draw it to represent pigment that was not dense, of medium density, or very dense.
Okay, can that be broken down into further characteristics?
It's possible.
Do you know whether Mr. Godet broke it down into, for example, 6 characteristics?
He may have.
You're not familiar with those, correct?
I haven't memorized to what degree he has divided down the microscopic characteristics, but I know that he has gone into some detail.
How about pigment size?
For pigment size, the size of the individual granules can be small, medium, or large.
How about pigment distribution?
The distribution of the pigment, as it appears in the cortex, can be, as I described earlier today, either concentrated in the area along the medulla, so that it would be medullary, or it can be apparent along the outside towards the periphery of the hair, consequently it would be called peripheral, or it can appear to be the same throughout the whole shaft, and it would be called general.
All right, are there any other characteristics of pigment distribution?
It would refer also to clumping, to the degree of clumping. It's particularly evident in hairs of Negroid origin that the pigment will clump together in groups, and these can be large groups or small groups.
What about graying? What is that?
What is gray?
Graying as a pigment distribution characteristic.
I'm not sure.
What about cortical texture? What categories would there be for cortical texture?
The cortex, the area right in the central part of the hair shaft, can demonstrate a streaked appearance, and what it is where some of the hair cells in the cortex are just more defined, and consequently they're visible microscopically. So the cortex cells could be visible.
By the way, there's variation on each of these characteristics from hair to hair in the same individual, are there not?
Sometimes.
And by treatment, what is meant by treatment?
Treatment could be, again, dyeing of the hair to alter the color, bleaching of the hair to remove the pigment granules.
What would be the sub-characteristics in terms of the medulla? How would you characterize or describe the medulla?
As I stated earlier this morning, the medulla, if it is dark in color, is opaque. If you can see through the medullary cells, it is translucent. If the medulla goes the entire shaft of the hair, it is continuous. If there is a break in it periodically, it is discontinuous. If there is a large space and a break along the central part of the shaft between the medulla, it would be called broken. The medulla can vary in size from being very thin to being slightly larger, to being medium, to being large or thick in its appearance.
How about the maximum diameter of the hair? What are the subgroups for that?
The maximum diameter, the hair can either be very fine, which would be a small diameter, it can be a medium diameter, or it can be coarse.
Do you have that in terms of millimeters?
No, sir, I do
Did
not.
you make any notes as to measurements of the
I do not
diameters of
numerically
any of the hairs you examined?
I do not numerically measure the hairs, no.
What about the medullary index? What does that mean?
The medullary index refers to how much space the medulla occupies as opposed to the entire width of the hair. And the medullary index is usually 1/3. That means that the medulla in a human hair will usually, at the maximum, occupy 1/3 the total distance of the hair.
For purposes of comparison, in any of these hairs, did you calculate the medullary index?
No, sir.
All right. What is meant by the shaft, and what are the subvariations of the shaft of the hair?
I'm not quite sure.
Well, in terms of morphological description, what does Gaudet mean in terms of the shaft? You know,
can't testify what somebody else.
I can agree with that.
are you familiar with Gaudet's characterizations on the shaft?
Offhand, I don't recall what they are now.
What is the cuticular margin?
The cuticular margin would be the area here where the cuticle comes in contact with the cortex.
All right. And what are the descriptive subcategories for the cuticular margin?
Well, that would depend on the cuticle appearing to be a solid line, or whether there is pigment gapping, where you'll have pigment that will be present and it'll look like it dips and it'll go along and dips again. And it's just a variation of the presence of a pigment along the cuticle.
Did you make any notes as to Mr. Bundy's hair in respect to cuticular margin?
I stated about pigment gapping in it, yes, sir.
In reference to the cuticle, you stated about the pigment, gapping slight to medium. Were you speaking of the cortex, or were you speaking of the cuticular margin when you said
It
that?
would be the definition of the cuticle because of the presence of the pigmentation.
Vacuoles. Did you examine for vacuoles?
The vacuoles, I assume he's speaking of particular fusi, which would be just little small, usually spherical air holes found along the shaft of the hair.
Were there any roots on any of the hairs in Exhibit 17?
From the pantyhose of the two unknown, yes.
How many roots were there?
The two Caucasian head hairs had roots.
Where they appeared to be, did the hair appear to have been live at the time?
Both roots had a rounded bulbous appearance that I described earlier this morning as being that of the telogen root, the root that is essentially not growing any longer and just waiting to be pushed out of the hair, of the follicle, by another hair.
What are the characteristics for the tip of the hair?
Well, as I described to you earlier, when I drew the tip on several times over there, that the tip can be tapered if the hair is a body hair or a pubic hair, or if it is a head hair that has not been cut. The tip can have a squared end where it has been scissor cut. It can have a triangular end, cut at an angle, usually from a razor cut, or the hair can be frayed as from damage because the hair is long and the ends are starting to split.
Did you estimate the time from which the tip was cut?
No, sir. Mm-mm.
That can be done, can it not?
Some people are able to do it, yes, sir.
And why are they able to do it?
Checking. Sustain.
If she knows that.
Question is, did she do it or did she didn't do it?
It's fair to say you're not able to do that.
I have not done it, no.
How long were these hairs in Exhibit 17?
I believe one was approximately 2 inches, and I believe the other was approximately 1.5 inches.
Did you do a scale count on these hairs?
No, sir.
What is meant by scale count?
A scale count is taking the strand of hair, laying it on a microscope slide, and there are several procedures you can use to do this. I'm going to make a scale cast by taking a bottle of regular nail polish and running it along the hair shaft and allowing it to dry. You can pull the hair shaft off, and this will leave in the nail polish, the dry nail polish, an outline of the scale pattern of the hair. You can also do this by putting it down in hot acetate sheets that are just slightly soft so that it will retain the image of the scales of the hair. And I don't do scale casts because of a study that I made in the laboratory where I examined several people's hair and did a scale count. Over a certain unit area, I counted the number of scales that were present.
did it on several different intervals along the hair and then on several hairs from the same individual. And all of the scale counts came from 15 to 19, which was, they all sort of fell in together around the same area. There was nothing distinctive enough to separate them to make them useful for comparison.
How many samples was that?
Approximately 6 or 7 people, I believe, in the lab.
6 or 7 people?
Yes, sir.
Have you done any reading in the area on scale counts?
Some reading, yes, sir.
Are you familiar with
Let's see with
Hoffman's
her
system?
blackboard, Mr.
Just a temporary digression, Judge. You can have a seat to be more comfortable. We'll go through scale counts. Are you familiar with Hoffman's system on scale counts?
Offhand, the name doesn't mean anything to me now.
This is familiar with it being a major system for distinguishing between features of hairs by scale counts?
Objection.
Not unless that includes human as well as animal, because scale counts are quite significant in determining animal identity, but not necessarily so for human identity or examination.
Are you familiar with Moritz's system for scale counting?
Just offhand, no.
Familiar with the 7 types and patterns of scales as set out by Moritz?
Your Honor, she said.
She's answered that, and the answer is no.
Are you familiar with Weilmann's system for scale counting?
As far as human hair, no.
So you're neither familiar with either Hoffman, Moritz's, or
Need to
Weilmann?
recapitulate her testimony, Mr.
Returning to Mr. Gaudet's system for morphological characteristics, did you examine any cross-section contour as a morphological characteristic?
Your Honor, I object. She said.
Sustained. She's answered. She did no cross-section.
Are there several cross-section characteristics that are recommended to be done by other examiners in the field of hair microscopy?
I don't know of any forensic examiners in any laboratory system that do cross-sections routinely for hair comparison.
Well, having recognized Mr. Gradwell on legal evidence, do you agree or disagree with this quote from Mr. Gradwell? The value of transverse sections is beyond doubt. Unquote.
I'd like to see the remaining of the article, please.
But longitudinal sections are of less worth in the forensic field. What do you think about the quote, the value of transverse sections is beyond doubt?
What she thinks.
Sustained.
Do you agree or
What's she-
disagree with it?
Your Honor, I object.
You're going to give her a passage, give it to her consistent with the whole passage, and let her make a determination.
The value of transverse sections is beyond doubt. Do you agree or disagree?
Your Honor,
That
she
was-
said she wanted to see the article.
I would sustain the objection.
Welcome to read the article.
Let her look at it.
Is this Mr. Haggard's treatment?
I don't know what it is, Mr. Simpson.
Gradwell on legal medicine.
Which part of the
Sure,
article?
the passage, Mr.
As far as the value of a cross-section, The reference that Gradwell is making here is, as I explained to you earlier today, Negroid hair is flat and ribbon-like. This can best be demonstrated by performing a cross-section and examining it microscopically. Oriental hair is cylindrical. If you make a cross-section of the hair, this can be demonstrated and examined microscopically. The Caucasian hair, as I said, is sort of ovoid, a little nondescript. By making a cross-section, this can be demonstrated. But there are other microscopic characteristics that can be examined in the hair along the shaft that would be able to give you an opinion as to whether the hair is of Negroid origin, Oriental origin, or Caucasian origin, such that a cross-section is not necessary.
Are you saying you only make cross-sections for Negroid hair?
No, sir, I do not make cross-sections.
You do not make cross-sections, period.
No, sir, I do not.
Do you agree or disagree with Mr. Gradwell that the value of a transverse section is beyond doubt?
Beyond doubt of what?
Beyond doubt in having value in making a morphological determination as to the similarity or dissimilarity of two hairs.
Objection, Your Honor. How does Mr. Haggard know what this man meant either?
I read the article. What's the story?
I don't know if you read that or not.
Do you agree or
She's already
disagree?
testified she does not do it.
Or may I infer, Your Honor, she
You
doesn't do it?
I think you may, and I got that inference 10 minutes ago, Mr. Haggard.
Do you disregard Mr. Gaudet's recommendation for examining 7 characteristics, 7 morphological characteristics in terms of cross-section? 1, cross-section of contour. Cross 2.
Stain, I'm going to get you back into cross-section at all. The lady hasn't been into it, and you're not going to go into it.
Your Honor, it goes to the value of her.
I know it goes. You offer some testimony on it.
Are there additional morphological characteristics that Mr. Gaudet sets out?
Offhand, I don't know.
Let me ask you if you have heard of these since you have recognized him as an authority in the field. Cross-section contour, the cross-section cuticle, cross-section color, cross-section pigment density, cross-section pigment size, cross-section pigment distribution, cross-section cortical textures.
Objection.
Do you recognize?
Sustained. Ask the jury to disregard any reference to cross-section. The court's ruled on it. Go ahead.
Is it your testimony that you can make a valid comparison without reference to cross-sections?
Yes, sir.
I'll let her ask that.
Yes, sir.
Is there any reason you have as an examiner for ignoring 7 out of 22 of the characteristics set out by Mr. Gaudet?
I'm going to object. We have been through this and been through this.
Sustained.
Do you not feel that it affects, to ignore the cross-section, affects the reliability of your comparison?
Mark the record, Madam Clerk. Sustain the objection. Proceed on. Madam Reporter.
Your Honor, could we have a sidebar?
No, not on that.
Well, may we respectfully object that this
You can object all you want to.
denies us effective cross-examination and confrontation of the witness?
Put it in there. Proceed on. If you mention it one more time, I'll mark the record again.
Looking at Exhibit 17, You indicated you found 3 hairs,
Yes, sir.
and did you indicate whether all 3 of the hairs were human?
I stated earlier today that 2 of the hairs demonstrated characteristics of Caucasian head hair and 1 was an animal hair.
All right. What type of animal?
I don't know.
What were the morphological characteristics on the animal hair?
It was very fine in texture. It was approximately 2 inches long, I believe, and it had a medulla that was greater than 1/3 the width of the hair.
And simply because of the medulla, you concluded it was an animal hair?
No, sir, based on the other microscopic characteristics that were present, it was not similar to being that of a human hair.
How many animal hairs have you examined?
In my training, I examined the hairs of the deer family.
Excuse me. After this examination does not count, how many hairs have you examined prior to making this examination?
I object to him arguing with the witness. If he'll ask a question.
Qualifying question now. The question is, how many has she examined? If you want to withdraw the question and restate it, you may do so.
How many hairs had you examined prior to, I believe it was March 21st?
Now you've left out animal.
That were of an animal nature.
Offhand, I don't recall.
You know what kind of animal?
I beg your pardon?
Do you know what kind of animal this hair supposedly belonged to?
As I said earlier, I did not examine the animal hair, no.
Let's take hair number 1 found in Exhibit 17. What are the morphological characteristics of it?
The hair was light brown in color, approximately 2 inches long. It had a telogen root. The tip was cut.
Just a minute. I'd like to write with you if you mind. How was the tip cut?
It would have the apparent appearance of having been cut by scissors, but I do not know how it was cut.
Go ahead.
There were cortical fusi present. The cuticle was thick, yellowish in appearance. The scales were obvious, very obvious. The pigmentation was coarse, peripheral, with heavy streaking near the cortex. The amount of pigment was increased distally the further you got away from the root. And the pigment grouping had a streaked appearance in the cortex. The medulla was broken and thin, and the cortical cells were obvious.
Anything else?
On this particular one, no, sir, I have nothing else written.
What were the characteristics on hair number 2?
Essentially, it was the same, except that the pigmentation was more dense towards the distal portion of the hair, and that pigment granules were large.
Pigmentation was greater towards the proximal end or distal end?
Distal.
What else?
The medulla was continuous, translucent, and that it was average.
What was the color?
It was a medium brown color.
Medium brown?
Yes, sir, medium to dark brown color. And in this one, the pigment granules were particularly clumped in groups that were larger than ovoids and streaked in appearance.
How much difference was there between the medium dark brown color and the light brown color in hair number 1?
In the standard that I had, the range of color that the 30 hairs had that I examined was from a light brown through to a darker brown. And these two unknown hairs fit within the range of the light brown hairs, and the darker one fit in the range of the dark brown hairs.
So one was on one end of the light brown and the other one was on the other end of the dark brown.
Yes, sir.
Is this what you call a range of similarity?
Well, the range of similarity was in the standard.
In other words, if you can put it in at either end, you're going to say it's similar. Is that correct?
Objection.
No, sir.
I think you can restate that question and probably answer it. It's sort of argumentative the way that.
Well, one was light brown, and on the other end of the spectrum was dark brown, correct?
A darker brown, not dark brown.
And it's your subjective feeling that the colors are similar.
Objection.
I'll let her answer.
So,
Based on the microscopic examination and the presence of the pigment, there was a difference in color. One was lighter, one was darker.
by the way, you have a photograph of this?
No, sir.
Did you take any micro photographs?
No, sir.
Do you have equipment to do that?
Yes, sir.
Why didn't you do that?
We do not routinely photograph any hairs or fibers that are examined in casework.
This was just another routine case.
Yes, sir.
How about the tip on hair number 2? How was that cut?
It also had a similar appearance to the first hair. It had the squared off tip.
Well, was there a difference in the age of the cut?
I couldn't tell.
Did you examine for that?
Not specifically, because I am not that sure how much of a difference there is. I haven't had that much experience in determining the age of a cut on hair. So I had no premise to back up any kind of microscopic examination I would have made.
So you didn't know how to do that?
Is he asking her a question, or is he making a statement for the record, John?
He's flirting.
How about in hair number 2? Were there any cortical fusi?
Yes, sir.
How many?
Numerous cortical fusi.
Do you have any notes on hair number 2?
The ones that I gave you earlier, just the information that I gave you earlier.
That's your complete notes on hair number 2?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any note in there in hair number 2 on the thickness of the cuticle?
Yes, that the cuticle was thick.
Do you have a specific note of that?
Yes.
You didn't read that earlier.
I'm sorry.
Do you have any notation on the color of the cuticle in hair number 2?
That it was yellowish.
Do you have a specific note? May I examine the notes in order to facilitate this?
Certainly.
Which is this for?
This is hair number 2. Cuticle's thick. Cuticle's yellowish.
Where's hair number 1?
Right up there. Cuticle's thick. Cuticle's yellow.
I can see this one moment.
Can you see it here, please?
Yes.
Judge, the lady is.
I didn't give her back the notes.
Don't pull them from her. Second jury out, Mr. Watson.
Yes, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, please retire to the jury room.